and what is the e-consent framework, I would advise and a tip for you all will be to consult with the Research Ethics Office or the Privacy Office when applicable for their advice on the requirements for electronic consent for your particular study. Depending on the risk level of your study in terms of the data you're collecting, there could be a spectrum of requirements of how consent is collected, what needs to be included, whether a PDF has to be generated, and so on and so forth. So I would highly encourage you to consult with the Research Ethics Office and our Privacy Office on what the requirements are for your particular study. However, during this presentation, I will demonstrate how an e-consent form could be created using the tools that are available with the e-consent framework. So why is it called the e-consent framework? Is that it's basically a list of options and tools that you can use to help facilitate e-consent. Now, of course, you don't have to use all of the options and features because, again, based on your requirements, you may not need to use them all. So I'm back at the survey settings, so I quickly went. So you see here, this is from similar to what we did earlier with the surveys. At the very bottom, there's the e-consent framework. Basically, it kind of turns the surveys into an e-consent form. And before I go on to the options here, I just want to point out there is a simpler version of the e-consent framework, which is called the PDF Auto Archiver. So this could be used not just for e-consent. It could be used for specific surveys that you're doing that you think it's a requirement, or you think you prefer it for the PDF, automatically PDF as participants submits their survey responses, and it can generate a PDF version of their responses for you automatically. But for this demo, I'm going to mostly focus on the e-consent. So there's a list of options. So I'm going to go through them and let me know if you have any questions. So there is an option, allow e-consent responses to be edited by users. It's by default, it's unchecked because typically for consent, you do not want anyone to be able to modify it after consent is signed. It's just for integrity. But however, if you do have a requirement where you need to countersign the consent form on the same form. So if the research team's signature and the participant signature has to appear on the same form, the way to do that is to actually allow e-consent responses to be edited by users. That way you can go back after the participant signs it, then you can go back and sign it and kind of finalize that consent. Next, with some of the simpler options, the e-consent version, that's to help you keep track of which version of the consent this is. So the longer the period the study runs for, the more and more likely the consent forms changes, gets updated, and this way you can keep track of it, and this version number will appear as part of the PDF, so from a glance you will know which version the participant has signed. And sometimes, next we have first name and last name field. First of all, this has to be appear on your form. It does not get automatically added. If you don't have these fields in your consent form, you can't have it in your PDF. But sometimes one of the requirements is that you have to have your names on the PDF, on every page of the PDF. This is the way to do it, where you tell REDCap. Yes.
A couple of questions that come in the Q&A that maybe would be good for you to cover live, Michael, if you could.
Yes.
The first question was, could you show them how to use piping?
Yes, I can do that. I will do that next after going through this list, and I can show you how to do that.
Okay. The second question said, all of my 4 instruments require the ID participant. What is the best form to put the variable name? Could it be the same in all the instruments?
ID instrument, okay. ID in all instruments. Yes, I can show you that. But basically, as a simple response to that question would be to have as text fields, and I'll show you both as piping and for, actually piping is the preferred option so that your study ID or record ID is actually only technically entered once in your data set, so they're not going to be multiple columns just with record ID, but they can be displayed in all your forms if that's your requirement or your preference. I can definitely demonstrate that as one demo after going through the e-consent with piping as well. Yes, and a tip here is that sometimes with consent forms, you may not have a first name and last name separated field. You may have just name, which is similar to my first demo, which just has one field for name. And the way to do that would be just not select the second last name. Just choose one of them and select name as your name field. This is a type, so if your study actually has different consent forms for different groups within your study, let's say one for parents, one for the child, or for the guardian, or one for the clinician, that their family doctor, another one for the participants, then you can kind of specify here so that it'll also appear in your consent form, so you know exactly which consent form from a client. You don't have to read the text to figure out, because sometimes consent forms are very similar, just some sections are there and some sections are not, so this will help a lot. And here we have date of birth as well. Sometimes it's a requirement, sometimes it's not. So that, again, I would encourage you to touch base with the research ethics office and or the privacy office to figure out what are the requirements for e-consent for your particular study. So if date of birth is required, here's the option to select date of birth to also be included in your PDF. For signature fields to be erased in the previous page. So this will make a little bit more sense on how this will work, but basically what this does, you can select a field that specifies for signature. So that could be the traditional signature where you use your hand to write it. Some studies I've heard where they don't want those traditional signature and actually want more of a yes/no question for providing consent, because they consider a traditional signature as another identifier. So to mediate that, they would just remove that and use a yes/no question instead. And what this option does is that if you tell REDCap that that is actually your signature field, then it would, when they get to the page where they're verifying the information they provided is accurate and they realize that something is inaccurate, they press previous page and they go back to the consent form to change it. The signature fields, whichever fields you specify signature fields, would be erased, and they will have to fill those out again. And that could be actually a signature, or it could be specific fields that's on your consent form. And another thing to note is that coupled with all these fields, the PDF generation, allowing participants to download PDF, which I kind of gloss over it, during my previous demo, is that this could be useful for if you want them to have the option to just download their signed consent form when they complete the consent form. It's just simply they have a download link. The other option is, if this is allowed by the REB or the privacy office, is that if you can do a confirmation email and then attach their signed consent form as an attachment. Of course, we have to note that oftentimes consent forms, there are identifiers, their names, maybe the date of birth, and based on the risk level of your project, you may not be allowed to do this, because this would mean that identifiers would be going to their email inbox, which is very likely to be a Gmail or Hotmail, for example. So again, I advise to touch base with the REB and or the privacy office. So let me just do that. And all you do, it's save changes, and then that's all you have to do for the consent form. So before I get to the piping, I just want to show a quick example of what it looks like. So this is definitely not a consent form, but I kind of a very simple version of what I've enabled for consent. So you see here, there is a more traditional signature, date of birth, first and last name. Oh, and a tip. For the text for the consent form, you have two options. One is copy and paste the text, like from your Microsoft Word file or from your PDF, and just paste it directly into REDCap. And there is also an editor that can help you format it the way you want it, whether it's bolding text or highlight certain sections, for example. The other way is to take screenshots. So if your consent form formatting is key and you got it right, and it's been signed off, and it's in the Microsoft Word or PDF format, what you could do is take screenshots of those pages and just upload them as images to REDCap. However, if you go down, you want to use images and screenshots, I would advise to test it and make sure it's is visible and easy to read for people that are accessing it from their tablet or the smartphone, just in case, because sometimes images may get too big or and all sorts. And if you have any questions on how to do that, or if there's any issues when you're uploading your files, let us know at redcap.support@ubc.ca, and we can advise and help you with getting it right. So very quickly, I kind of touched on it. There is a verification step in consent, the e-consent framework, which is to display the information that they provided just to make sure it's correct, and they certify that all the information above is correct. So, oops. So this is where right below it, I couldn't include in the screenshot, it's getting too big, but there is a previous button. So if they've realized, oh, my date of birth is incorrect, for example, they can press previous and update their date of birth to the accurate date of birth. And this signature will be cleared, which for this example, I have selected as a signature field, and they will have to re-sign the consent form. And this is where I was showing the download the survey response PDF. So this is the signed consent form, and you can download a copy for themselves. Okay. Missed a step here, which is, sorry, missed a slide here. All the PDFs of the consent forms are in the file repository, which is accessible from the left side menu of your REDCap page. And you can download the PDF, and you also can see here the type, the version, and to help identify which PDF it is and which version they signed, for example.